Queen Mary didn't inherit a secure monarchy. She inherited a problem. Her family was German enough to be dangerous, royal enough to be watched, expensive enough to be resented, and emotionally stiff enough to collapse under modern scrutiny. Then came war, revolution, cousins shot in basements, crowns falling across Europe, and the terrifying realization that monarchy was no longer guaranteed by God, blood, or habit. Queen Mary understood the lesson earlier than almost anyone. If the royal family wanted to survive, it had to become more British, more disciplined, more symbolic, and much less human in public. So she helped build the machine. She collected the jewels, arranged the rooms, trained the children, judged the marriages, erased the softness, and turned a family into a dynasty. That transformation didn't happen by accident. It happened because the woman at the center of it knew, from girlhood, exactly what it felt like to stand close to power without quite possessing it. She was born Victoria Mary Augusta Louise Olga Pauline Claudine Agnes on May 26, 1867, at Kensington Palace. The family called her May. Her mother, Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, was a granddaughter of King George III, British blood, genuine royal stock, but from a junior branch that occupied the comfortable margins of the family tree. Her father was Prince Francis of Teck, a German duke from a house that was royal without being entirely equal, descended from what European courts called a morganatic line, a union that didn't fully qualify for the highest dynastic marriages. May was, by birth, simultaneously royal and not quite royal enough. That double status would define everything that followed. It was also a status that came with bills it couldn't pay. By 1884, the Duke of Teck's debts had grown so severe that the family could no longer remain in England. They were obliged to go into exile, settling in Florence, unable to meet their creditors at home. Princess Mary Adelaide had been accumulating obligations for years, writing repeated pleas to the Crown for financial relief that went largely unmet. For several years, the future Queen of England lived abroad in reduced circumstances, watching her parents negotiate the humiliating distance between their title and their means. This isn't a minor biographical detail. It's the psychological engine of everything that follows. May of Teck grew up understanding that status could evaporate, that rank without resources was a performance nobody believed for long, and that the gap between royal and truly secure was a chasm a single generation could fall into. She would spend the rest of her life ensuring nobody in her family fell again. Her tools would be jewels, marriages, children, and an iron discipline that many people would call coldness. It wasn't coldness. It was the particular resolve of someone who had looked precariousness in the face and decided methodically never to feel it again. James Pope Hennessy, who was given access to the royal archives for Queen Mary's authorized biography, a 715-page work published in 1959, characterized her as possessing a sort of genius for sensing how the British monarchy itself could best survive. That genius didn't descend from privilege. It was forged by its absence. The path that took May of Teck from Florence to the British throne ran through two brothers, one of whom died 6 weeks after proposing to her. In December 1891, at age 24, May became betrothed to Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, the eldest son of the Prince of Wales and second in line to the throne. A nation began preparing for a royal wedding. On January 14, 1892, just 6 days after his 28th birthday, Prince Albert Victor died of influenza. The engagement had lasted barely 5 weeks. What happened next operated on a dynastic logic that was explicit at the time. George, Albert Victor's younger brother and now the heir presumptive, needed a wife of suitable standing. May of Teck, already vetted, already approved by Queen Victoria, already publicly mourning, was available. On July 6, 1893, at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace, May married the new heir. She had transferred without a public scene from one royal brother to another. May's own feelings about this transfer were never documented for the archive. George and May had known each other since childhood, and their subsequent correspondence, sustained across long separations during his naval career and their India tour of 1905 to 1906, suggests genuine partnership rather than mere institutional contract. Biographers who examined their letters describe a marriage that combined real affection with a shared understanding of what monarchy required. In that alignment, they were functionally well matched. What the engagement transfer established before she ever became queen was a template. Personal circumstance bends to dynastic need. Desire is managed. Position is accepted. May of Teck had not become a Windsor by negotiating terms. She had become one by understanding there were no other terms on offer. That understanding would later shape every demand she made of her own children. George V ascended the throne in 1910. His dynastic surname was Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, the name of Prince Albert's house, inherited through the male line from Victoria's consort. In 1910, it seemed merely historical. By 1917, it had become a liability that could end the dynasty. The First World War made being German a social crime in Britain. Prince Louis of Battenberg, first Sea Lord, was forced to resign in 1914 simply because of his German birth, despite decades of loyal naval service and British citizenship. By the spring of 1917, German Gotha aircraft were bombing London directly. The public mood toward anything bearing a German name had curdled into something that threatened to attach to the royal family itself. The pressure to act came from Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who urged George V to relinquish German titles and adopt a British name. The king initially resisted. Royal houses weren't typically renamed. He apparently preferred the name Stuart to invoke continuity with the last non-German line. But Lloyd George vetoed it for its historical complications. The name ultimately chosen came from Arthur Bigg, Lord Stamfordham, George V's private secretary, who suggested Windsor, the castle, the town, the deep English heartland, while the court was staying there. On July 17, 1917, at Buckingham Palace, in a specially convened Privy Council meeting attended by the Prime Minister, 3 former Prime Ministers, and representatives of the Dominions, George V issued the Royal Proclamation. From that day forward, the family would be styled and known as the House and Family of Windsor. All German degrees, styles, dignities, and titles were formally relinquished. A dynasty had changed its identity by decree. Queen Mary's brothers were directly swept up in the renaming. Prince Adolphus of Teck, governor of Windsor Castle, was created Marquess of Cambridge on July 16th, one day before the main proclamation. Prince Alexander of Teck became the Earl of Athlone. The Battenberg relatives simultaneously became Mountbattens. An entire family's continental inheritance was exchanged wholesale for English geography. Queen Mary's documented role in driving this decision is absent from the record. The mechanics belonged to Lloyd George, Stamfordham, and a reluctant George V. But the decision was consistent with everything she had embodied since childhood: that legitimacy is constructed, that names carry stories, and that a family under existential threat must control the story it tells. She had already lived through her own family's loss of English footing. Now the dynasty followed her toward firmer ground. There is a detail the sources don't remark upon, but the calendar makes unavoidable. The Windsor Proclamation was signed on July 17, 1917. Tsar Nicholas II and his family were executed on July 17, 1918, exactly 12 months later, in a basement in Yekaterinburg. One date marks the beginning of a survival strategy, the other marks the cost of not having one. Nicholas II and George V were first cousins. Their mothers, Alexandra and Maria Fyodorovna, were sisters, daughters of King Christian IX of Denmark. The two men had grown up in each other's orbit, addressed each other as Georgie and Nicky in correspondence, and looked so physically similar that contemporaries describe them as nearly interchangeable. The same blue eyes, the same beard, the same bearing. Photographs from the early 20th century show them standing side by side at military reviews, and the resemblance is arresting enough to require a caption. When Russia descended into revolution in March 1917 and Nicholas abdicated, George V initially offered his cousin asylum. Britain's ambassador communicated that hospitality was available. Then, the offer was withdrawn. The reasons are contested. Lloyd George's government was nervous about socialist sentiment spreading in Britain, while Lord Stamfordham reportedly worried about the public reaction to sheltering a deposed autocrat. Whether George V withdrew the offer personally or was overruled by political pressure remains disputed by historians. What is certain is that asylum was never granted, and on July 17, 1918, Nicholas, his wife Alexandra, their 4 daughters, their son Alexei, and several household members were taken to the basement of the Apatiev house in Yekaterinburg and shot. George V later sent HMS Marlborough in 1919 to rescue the Dowager Empress and Nicholas's sisters from the Crimea, a gesture that indicates some residual family obligations survived the political failure. Too late for Nicholas himself. By the time the guns stopped in November 1918, 3 great European dynasties had ceased to exist. The Russian Empire had collapsed in 1917. The German Empire followed in November 1918 when Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated. The Austro-Hungarian Emperor Karl I abdicated the same month. Of the 3 great empires that had entered the war in 1914, not one survived it. No primary source records exactly what Queen Mary concluded from watching this happen, but the structural argument is unmistakable. The monarchies that endured, Britain, the Netherlands, the Scandinavian kingdoms, were the ones that had worked, decade by decade, to embed themselves in national life rather than float above it. They had become visible, accessible, symbolic. The ones that looked isolated, foreign, or simply unable to adapt to what their populations expected of them didn't survive the scrutiny that 4 years of catastrophic war brought to every institution. A man who looked almost exactly like the British king had been shot in a basement because his family had run out of legitimacy. That was the argument for everything Queen Mary had been doing since 1910 and would continue doing for the rest of her life. Between 1910 and the end of her life, Queen Mary added more than 2,000 items to the royal collection: paintings, books, photographs, decorative art objects, Chinese jade, hard stones, furniture rescued from palace storerooms, Shakespeare-related memorabilia catalogued with the same attention she gave to everything else. At Windsor Castle, she maintained a dedicated Stuart room and a lace room specifically for family relics and souvenirs. She catalogued objects that had sat unexamined for decades, writing in a letter in 1912 that she had been routing out nice old furniture and things in the palace stores which no one but the furniture inspectors had seen for years. The Royal Collection Trust's account of this period describes her work as helping to solidify the identity of the British monarchy in the early 20th century as enduring, family-focused, and, where necessary, thrifty. Her organizing philosophy was framed as conservation, reversing dispersals, recovering what had been lost, tidying the chaotic leavings of earlier collectors. The framing was self-effacing. The cumulative effect was anything but. At the Delhi Durbar of 1911, she wore the Cambridge Emerald Purure, necklace, earrings, and stomacher, set with stones from the historic Cambridge Emerald collection that she had newly commissioned for the occasion. The Cullinan diamonds, cut from the largest gem-quality rough diamond ever found, were worn regularly. She often suspended the 530-carat pear-shaped Cullinan I from the Cullinan II at her chest. These weren't accessories, they were arguments, that the crown had accumulated centuries of weight, that history was physically present in the woman wearing it, and that the woman wearing it had understood this completely. No surviving statement by Queen Mary explicitly connects her collecting to dynastic survival strategy. She didn't leave a manifesto. But the retrospective pattern is unmistakable. Every room she organized, every jewel she acquired or reassembled, every archive she cataloged, contributed to the same institutional case. This family has been here a very long time and understands what it is. Objects carry stories. Stories carry legitimacy. Legitimacy, in a constitutional monarchy with no coercive power, is the only thing that actually protects you when the public's loyalty becomes a matter of choice rather than obligation. Her contemporaries sometimes experienced the collecting differently. There were accounts of hostesses who found objects leaving their houses after royal visits, gifts that felt more pressured than freely given. One description captured her as being so visibly enraptured by a piece that its owner felt unable to refuse. Later analysis generally concluded she was a determined and diligent collector, rather than something more troubling. But the question itself reveals the intensity of the drive. She was acquiring on behalf of an institution she had decided to protect with everything available to her, including the discomfort of the people she visited. George V and Queen Mary had 6 children: Edward, Albert, Mary, Henry, George, and John. As parents, they were documented by biographers as cold and formal, in ways that went beyond even the Edwardian norm. George V's own statement on the subject survives in biographies, misspellings intact. "I was afraid of my father, and I am going to be damn sure that my children are afraid of me." He reportedly had children's pockets sewn shut, spanked the older sons, and was described as barking, "Can't you stop that child crying?" at caregivers. Queen Mary wrote of one infant son that she really believed he was beginning to like her at last and was "most civil to me," a sentence that treats maternal recognition as a diplomatic development worth noting. Biographers describe her as maintaining what they call an unnaturally detached attitude toward her children throughout their lives. She never initiated conversations about their personal relationships, communicated during long separations through required weekly letters rather than presents, and apparently never attempted matchmaking or the warmer forms of maternal management. This is usually framed as tragedy. By the internal logic of the system Queen Mary had internalized since the Florence years, it was coherent. The institution required heirs who understood what they were for. Sentimental attachment was a luxury the crown couldn't afford. The children would learn to subordinate personal desire to public role, because that was the only version of Windsor she believed could endure modern scrutiny. She hadn't been given a choice herself in the engagement transfer from Eddie to George. Neither, as she saw it, would they. The cost was visible in each of them. Edward, the eldest, called David within the family, grew into a man of considerable public charm and documented private need. His memoir, A King's Story, published in 1951, describes an austere upbringing with a nostalgic longing that implies grief rather than simple fondness. The emotional stiffness he was trained to perform publicly made him hunger privately for something warmer and unconditional. That hunger is the direct biographical engine of Wallis Simpson. Albert, the second son, later George VI, developed a severe stammer that followed him through every public speech and every radio broadcast for decades. He worked with Australian speech therapist Lionel Logue from approximately 1926 onward to manage it. Biographers have suggested connections between his childhood experiences and the stammer's severity, though the causal link isn't confirmed in primary sources. What is documented is that he was a man of genuine internal anxiety who nonetheless performed his duty completely when it was demanded of him, at every stage, regardless of what it cost. The youngest son, Prince John, born July 12, 1905, suffered his first epileptic seizure at age 4. By 1916, as his seizures became more frequent and severe, he was sent to live at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, under the care of his governess, Charlotte Bill. No official portraits of him were commissioned after 1913. His epilepsy wasn't disclosed publicly while he lived. Queen Mary arranged for local children to be brought to Sandringham as playmates. John became close to a girl named Winifred Thomas, whose family worked at the royal stables, and they took nature walks together through Queen Alexandra's garden. John died in his sleep at Wood Farm after a severe seizure. He was 13 years old. Queen Mary wrote in her diary that the news was a great shock, but that for John, death came as a great relief. In a subsequent letter to a friend, she wrote that he had been spared much suffering. George V described his son's death as the greatest mercy possible. Edward, then 24 and barely acquainted with his youngest brother, wrote to his mother a letter he later acknowledged as cold and unsympathetic. He apologized afterward, acknowledging that he had barely known his youngest brother. Queen Mary didn't reply to the original letter. Her final diary entry noted that she missed the dear child very much. The family had, in private, loved John. They had also, in public, managed him, kept him from view, concealed his diagnosis, housed him apart from the main household. That combination, genuine private grief alongside systematic public management of anything that might compromise the institution's image, is the clearest available lens for understanding Queen Mary as a parent. She wasn't inhuman. She was operating a system that she had decided was the only viable protection for everything else she cared about, and she operated it without visible exception. On November 16, 1936, Edward VIII dined with his mother and sister at Marlborough House. He had been king for 10 months. He told them he intended to marry Wallis Simpson, an American-born socialite, twice divorced, whose first husband was still living, and he asked Queen Mary to receive her. Queen Mary refused. When he pressed her for a reason, the answer was immediate. Because she is an adventuress. The constitutional problem was stark. Under the Church of England, whose supreme governor was the monarch, remarriage while a former spouse was living wasn't permitted. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin had already told Edward directly that such a marriage wouldn't be acceptable to the people. The Dominions were consulted and largely opposed. Edward's position was that he intended to marry Wallis regardless, and if the government opposed it, he was prepared to go. The refusal wasn't instinctive distaste. Queen Mary had previously met Wallis Simpson. She had shaken her hand at an earlier court presentation. The 1936 refusal was a deliberate institutional verdict. issued on behalf of an institution, not a woman she had never encountered. Queen Mary wrote to Edward, more than once, according to James Pope Hennessy, who in the 1950s was shown letters from the pre-abdication period by Edward himself. Pope Hennessy recorded that in one letter, Queen Mary seemed to be begging her son not to proceed. Another letter urged him specifically not to deliver the abdication broadcast. He delivered it anyway, on December 11, 1936, heard across the empire, 326 days after he had ascended the throne. Queen Mary's own account of what had happened was stated in writing. After the abdication, she wrote, "After all my life I have put my country before everything else, and I simply can't change now." That sentence isn't sentimental and not rhetorical. It identifies the criterion by which she had organized every decision since Florence, and it states plainly that her son had failed it. The institution came first. It had always come first. She couldn't accommodate a man who had chosen differently. There is a detail that captures the precision with which she processed the moment. The letter urging Edward not to deliver the broadcast addressed him as HRH, Prince Edward of Windsor. Not as king, not as the man she expected to broadcast his farewell to the nation, as a prince, with a courtesy title, in a castle he no longer owned. She had demoted him in the salutation before he had spoken a word. Publicly, she released a statement. The newspapers described her as exhibiting courage and dignity. Her public words on the matter were characteristic in their economy. "The person who needs most sympathy is my second son. He is the one who is making the sacrifice. Not Edward." Bertie. Edward had chosen desire. Bertie had accepted the institution. Queen Mary redirected her support accordingly, without hesitation or visible mourning for what she had preferred. She continued corresponding with Edward by letter afterward. When he visited London in October 1945, the first time she had seen her eldest son since before the abdication, 9 years, she received him at Marlborough House. He came alone. The Duchess of Windsor wasn't present. Prince Albert, Bertie, had married Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon at Westminster Abbey on April 26, 1923. Elizabeth was the daughter of the Earl of Strathmore, not royal by birth. There had been some hesitation about the match. Queen Mary inquired carefully into it. Accounts from the period describe her thoroughness, before encouraging Albert to proceed. In early January 1923, it was Queen Mary who prompted him to propose again after an earlier refusal. He did. Elizabeth accepted. The match was, in institutional terms, a strong one. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was warmly engaging, publicly graceful, and apparently untroubled by the demands of royal performance, in ways that would matter enormously when the institution was under maximum pressure. The evidence came during the Second World War. When Buckingham Palace was hit by German bombs in September 1940, George VI and Queen Elizabeth chose to stay in London. They visited bombed streets in the East End. They were photographed walking through rubble alongside the people whose houses had been destroyed. Elizabeth reportedly remarked that the bombing made her feel she could look the East End in the face. Whether the exact wording is precise, the strategy was deliberate, and the effect real. This was Queen Mary's formula, validated under fire. A monarchy that absorbed the same dangers as its subjects, that was visibly present in their suffering, rather than retreating to safety. That monarchy had a defensible claim on continued loyalty. George VI wasn't a natural public performer. The stammer alone would have been disabling in a weaker man, but he understood the requirement and he met it, with Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon beside him, across the most dangerous years any British monarch had faced in the 20th century. The contrast with Edward was total. Edward had been charming, modern, personally compelling, and popular in ways Bertie could never match. He had also chosen himself over the institution at the decisive moment. Bertie was anxious, ill-prepared, and had never expected to be king. He had also stayed. And Queen Mary, watching from Marlborough House, had placed her bet on duty over charisma. Wartime Britain proved her right in front of the entire world. Princess Elizabeth was born April 21, 1926, the daughter of the Duke and Duchess of York, the succession Queen Mary had helped put in place 3 years earlier. After the abdication, she became heir presumptive overnight, moving from comfortable third in line to the likeliest person to inherit a throne her uncle had just abandoned under global scrutiny. Queen Mary was, by the time Elizabeth was old enough to understand these things, an imposing presence in her granddaughter's formation. Their relationship wasn't warm in the conventional grandmother sense. It was instructional. Queen Mary conveyed through example, through posture, silence, the management of public occasions, the total absence of complaint regardless of circumstance, what the monarchy required. Personal impulses that conflicted with institutional dignity were managed internally without display. You appeared, performed, withdrew. You maintained the public face regardless of the private weather. Queen Mary had demonstrated her own understanding of this as recently as 1937, when she attended George VI's coronation, the first time in British history that a dowager queen had attended the coronation of a successor. She broke a centuries-old convention because she judged that the symbolic message of visible continuity outweighed the comfort of tradition. The institution's dignity was the first obligation, always. And if a precedent stood in the way of that dignity, the precedent gave way. Elizabeth II would carry the code into a reign of more than 70 years. The restraint during the aftermath of Diana's death in 1997, the measured silence in the face of decades of public controversy, the consistency of public duty maintained regardless of private circumstance. All of it was recognizable, to anyone who understood where it came from, as the Windsor operating system, encoded by a woman who had understood its necessity since she was a girl watching her family lose its home in Florence because it couldn't bridge the gap between title and means. Queen Mary died in 1953. She had explicitly instructed that if she died before the coronation, it should proceed as planned. She died 10 weeks before Elizabeth II was crowned at Westminster Abbey on June 2, 1953. She had watched her granddaughter accede to the throne. She had just not quite survived to see her crowned. The near miss is, in some ways, the most precise possible closing image. She had built the machine, installed the values, transmitted the code, and stepped aside just before the ceremony that would prove the machine worked. The dynasty ran without her because she had designed it to. Look at what Queen Mary actually built, assessed from the distance of the following decades, and the logic holds together. She didn't design it on paper. She assembled it through decisions made under pressure, most of them at costs she never publicly acknowledged. But the architecture is visible in retrospect. A family with no surname in 1910 had a British name by 1917. A collection of European royals with German titles had become, formally and in public imagination, a distinctly English institution. The royal collection, once dispersed, poorly documented, stored in palace rooms no one had opened in decades, had been reorganized into a visible argument for historical permanence. The children of George V and Queen Mary had been raised with a severity that produced, from the wreckage of one abdication, a king who stood in the rubble of bombed London and refused to leave. A granddaughter had been shaped who would spend the rest of the 20th century maintaining a discipline so consistent that the institution she represented outlasted every political movement that tried to make her irrelevant. None of this was inevitable. 3 great European monarchies had already collapsed within the living memory of everyone involved. The British monarchy's survival wasn't guaranteed by tradition, sentiment, or the accumulated weight of centuries. It required active management of image, of behavior, of scandal, of succession. Somebody had to understand that management was required, decide what form it needed to take, and spend decades insisting on it, even when the people closest to her resented every minute of it. George V, Lloyd George, Stamfordham, the wartime press, the constitutional settlement, all contributed. Queen Mary wasn't the sole architect, but she was, consistently, the person who embodied the requirements most completely, lived them without visible complaint, and demanded them of others without visible apology. She had been preparing to live them since 1884, when her family lost its home in England because it couldn't maintain the gap between its title and its creditors. Queen Mary's genius wasn't tenderness, it was survival. She understood that a monarchy couldn't afford to look improvised. Every jewel needed a story, every room needed a memory, every child needed a role, every scandal needed a punishment, every weakness needed to be hidden before the public could smell blood. That was the dynasty she helped build, hard, polished, British, disciplined, and emotionally expensive. It didn't make her children happy. It didn't make her daughters-in-law safe. It didn't make Edward obedient. But it made the Windsors last. Subscribe for more stories like this.